Let the dry legalities of inheritance codes and the cold calculus of dividing lines fade from your mind. Picture instead a chessboard, reset after a long and brutal game, only to have the same pieces placed back on the board. The year is 561. King Clothari, who spent a lifetime clawing his way back to sole rule, is dead. And almost immediately, the grim machinery of the Salic law begins to turn once more. His great reunified kingdom is not passed on intact. It is treated as a private estate, and the inheritance must be shared. His 4 surviving sons Cheribert, Guntram, Sigibert, and Chilper gather, not just to mourn, but to claim their portions. Once again, the map of Gaul is carved into a patchwork of rival realms, with capitals established in Paris, Orleans, and Burgundy, Metz, and Soult. It is a familiar, wearying cycle of decreed division. But this time a new element was introduced into the equation, an element that would transform the already cruel political rivalry into a bitter, personal war that would span 4 decades. This time, the conflict would not be driven by kings alone. It would be defined by 2 women, 2 queens of vastly different origins and ambitions, whose mutual hatred would engulf the Merovingian world in blood and fire. To understand this conflict, you must first meet Queen Brunhilda. She was not a Frank. She was a Visigothic princess, daughter of the powerful King Athanagild of Spain. Her marriage to King Sigibert of Austrasia, the Eastern Frankish kingdom, was a major political event. This was more than an alliance. It was a union of 2 of the most powerful Germanic dynasties in Europe. Brunhilda brought to the Frankish court not only royal blood, but also a sophisticated Romanized education. She was intelligent, literate, proud, and a devout Nicene Catholic. She was the embodiment of order, of Romanatus, and of legitimate, aristocratic ambition. Her arrival in Metz elevated Sigibert's court, lending it a cosmopolitan air that the courts of his brothers lacked. The success of this marriage planted an idea in the head of Sigibert's most ruthless and ambitious brother, King Chilperic of Neustria. Chilperic, ruling from Soissons, saw the prestige his brother had gained and wanted the same for himself. He too would have a Visigothic princess. To achieve this, he took drastic action. He repudiated his existing wife Audivera and cast aside his most beloved mistress, a woman of low birth named Fredegund. With his court cleared of prior attachments, he sent an embassy to Spain, asking for the hand of Galswintha, Brunhilda's elder sister. Galswintha arrived in Neustria with an immense dowry, a testament to her high status. She was a valuable piece in the Game of Thrones, and Chilperic had won her. But the marriage was doomed from the start. Chilperic, despite having his prize queen, could not forget Fredegund, and Fredegund was not a woman to be quietly set aside. Here, you must meet the second protagonist of this tragedy, Fredegund. If Brunhilda represented order and noble lineage, Fredegund was the embodiment of chaos and naked ambition. She came from the lowest rungs of society, beginning her life as a palace-serving girl, an anonymous face in the crowd. Through her beauty, her sharp intelligence, and an unbreakable force of will, she had captured the attention and affection of King Chilperic, becoming his mistress. She was the ultimate palace insider, a woman with no titles or lands, whose only power stemmed from her personal influence over the king. Being dismissed from court to make way for Galswintha was not just a setback. It was a profound humiliation, a wound her pride would never allow to heal. At the Neustrian court, Queen Galswintha was miserable. She found herself isolated and unloved. Before long, Chilperic, likely at Fredegund's constant urging, allowed his former mistress to return to the palace. Fredegund's presence was a public insult to Galswintha. The noble queen complained bitterly to her husband, begging to be allowed to return to Spain, even offering to leave her entire vast dowry behind, if only she could escape the unhappy marriage. Chilperic was faced with a choice. He did not want to lose the wealth and political prestige Galswintha represented, but he could not bring himself to part with Fredegund. He made a grim decision. One morning, attendants entered Queen Galswintha's chambers to find her dead in her bed. the marks on her neck indicating she had been strangled in her sleep. No official investigation was conducted. No one was punished. A few days later, King Chilperic officially married Fredegund and elevated her to the throne as his queen. The chronicler Gregory of Tours, our main source for this period, is unambiguous in his account, laying the blame for instigating the murder squarely at Fredegund's feet. Galswintha's death was not just a personal tragedy. It was the spark that ignited a wildfire. In Austrasia, Queen Brunhilda received the news of her sister's murder. Her grief quickly turned to a cold, implacable rage and a thirst for vengeance. This was no longer politics. This was now a feta, a family blood feud. As Galswintha's next of kin, Brunhilda had a sacred duty, by both Germanic custom and personal feeling, to demand justice for her sister's death. She used all of her considerable influence to press her husband Sigebert to act. At first, an attempt was made to resolve the conflict through law. The third brother, King Guntram of Burgundy, a man often portrayed as pious and peace-loving, stepped in to mediate. He convened an assembly of nobles. Rather than go to war, they attempted to apply the Selic law. They ruled that Chilperic, as a wergold or blood price for Galswintha's life, must turn over the 5 cities in Aquitaine that she had received as a wedding gift. These cities were to be given to Brunhilda as compensation. It was an attempt to impose legal order on an illegal act. Chilperic, perhaps to buy time, initially agreed to the judgment. But soon after, he reneged on his promise and sent his army to invade and retake the cities. The legal solution had failed. The law had proven powerless against ambition and hatred. Now, the only remaining option was war. The battle lines were drawn. The conflict was no longer a mere political rivalry between brothers over land, a predictable outcome of the Selic law. It had become a deeply personal, bitter, and intractable blood feud, fueled by the hatred of 2 powerful women. On one side stood Brunhilda, the noble Visigothic princess, demanding justice for her murdered sister and fighting for legitimate order. On the other stood Fredegund, the servant girl turned queen, fighting to protect her new status and her husband by any means necessary. What happens to a kingdom when the cold, impersonal logic of dynastic survival is consumed by the white-hot passion of personal hatred? The failure of King Guntram's legal mediation was the final crack in the fragile peace of the Frankish world. With Chilperic's brazen recapture of the cities he had promised as compensation, the matter passed from the assembly of nobles to the field of battle. Brunhilda's demand for vengeance now had the full force of her husband's kingdom behind it. King Sigebert of Austrasia, a capable and energetic ruler, mobilized his armies. He was not just fighting for his wife's honor. He saw a clear opportunity to destroy his ambitious brother and potentially reunite the northern Frankish kingdoms under his own rule. He launched a swift and devastating invasion of Chilperic's kingdom of New. Sigebert's military campaign was a stunning success. His armies, composed of fierce Frankish warriors from the east, as well as formidable Germanic mercenaries from across the Rhine, proved superior to Chilperic's forces. They swept through Neustria, capturing city after city. Chilperic, outmaneuvered and defeated in open battle, was forced to abandon his capital at Soissons and flee. He was cornered, his armies shattered, his kingdom on the verge of collapse. He and his queen Fredegund found themselves besieged in the fortified city of Tournai, the ancient seat of Childeric's power, with no hope of rescue. For Brunhilda and Sigebert, total victory seemed within their grasp. The nobles of Neustria, ever pragmatic, saw which way the political winds were blowing. They abandoned their defeated king and sent emissaries to Sigebert, offering him their allegiance. They were ready to raise him on a shield, the traditional Frankish ceremony for acclaiming a new king, and accept him as the sole ruler of both kingdoms. Sigebert, triumphant, traveled to the royal villa of Vitry to formally accept their submission. He had won. He had avenged his wife's sister, crushed his rival brother, and was about to become the most powerful king in Gaul. It is in this moment of absolute triumph that the nature of the conflict fundamentally changed. Fredegund, trapped in Terna with her husband, watching her entire world, about to be extinguished, did not surrender to despair. She was a woman who had risen from nothing, and she would not be defeated by the conventional rules of warfare. If her armies had failed, she would turn to a different weapon, one that was personal, silent, and far more terrifying. She would turn to the assassin's knife. From within the besieged city, Fredegund dispatched 2 young men. They were given a specific mission and armed with a specific type of weapon, the scremisax, the heavy single-edged Frankish knife, but with a deadly modification. Their blades had been coated with a powerful poison. They were instructed to present themselves to King Sigebert at Vitry as loyal defectors, seeking to pledge their allegiance. In the chaos and celebration of the victory camp, their arrival would arouse little suspicion. The 2 assassins carried out their mission with chilling precision. They gained access to the king's presence, and as they knelt before him, feigning homage, they drew their poisoned knives and plunged them into his sides. Sigebert, the victorious king, collapsed, mortally wounded, in the very hour of his greatest triumph. He died moments later. In the year 575, the assassination threw the Austrasian camp into immediate chaos and confusion. The leader was gone. The victory turned to ashes. The Neustrian nobles who had been ready to acclaim Sigebert now found themselves in a perilous position. Their old king Chilperic was still alive, and their new king was dead. They quickly reversed their allegiance once more, scrambling to make peace with the man they had just betrayed. The murder of Sigebert was a masterstroke of ruthless political calculation. In a single blow, Fredegund had not only saved her husband and her kingdom, but she had also completely upended the balance of power. The immediate beneficiary was, of course, her husband, Chilperic. He emerged from his siege in Terna, his kingdom miraculously restored, and quickly moved to seize the initiative. His first target was not the Austrasian army, but the source of the entire conflict, Queen Brunhilda. Brunhilda's world had been shattered. One moment she was the triumphant queen, her sister's death avenged. The next, she was a widow in a hostile land, her army leaderless and dissolving around her. She was captured by Chilperic's forces in Paris and taken prisoner. Her immense royal treasure was seized. Her young son, Chilpert II, who was only 5 years old, was also with her. For a moment, it seemed that the entire Austrasian royal line was about to be extinguished, just as the sons of Clodomir had been years before. But the Austrasian nobles, though they had lost their king, were not willing to lose their kingdom. One loyal duke managed to smuggle the young Prince Chilbert out of Paris and spirit him away to Metz, the Austrasian capital. There, the nobles, fiercely protective of their independence, acclaimed the 5-year-old boy as their new king. Brunhilda, however, remained a prisoner. She was exiled to a monastery in Rouen, her fate uncertain. For any other woman, this would have been the end of the story. But Brunhilda was not just any woman. She was a queen of immense resourcefulness and unyielding will. And in Rouen, an unexpected opportunity arose. One of Chilperic's own sons from his first repudiated wife, a prince named Merivik, was sent to the city. Merivik, who despised his stepmother Fredegund, saw in the captive queen a powerful potential ally. He was captivated by her beauty and her royal bearing. In a shocking and romantic act of defiance against his own father, Merivik fell in love with his aunt Brunhilda and married her. The marriage was a political scandal, condemned by the church as incestuous, but it served its purpose. It gave Brunhilda a protector and a means of escape. Though Chilperic soon arrived, separated the couple, and had his rebellious son tonsured and sent to a monastery. The distraction had given Brunhilda the time she needed. She managed to escape from her confinement and, after a perilous journey, made her way back to Austrasia. She returned not just as a dowager queen, but as the regent and guardian for her young son, King Chilbert II. She was now the undisputed ruler of the kingdom. The political chessboard was now set for the second, and even more personal, phase of the war. The conflict was no longer between two rival kings. It was now a direct confrontation between two rival queens. In Austrasia, Brunhilda held power, ruling in the name of her son. Her desire for vengeance against her sister's murderers now hardened into a cold, guiding principle of statecraft. In Neustria, Fredegund sat beside her husband Chilperic, her influence absolute, her power secured through assassination, her primary goal, the destruction of the woman who embodied everything she was not. For the next decade, the war between them was fought not primarily on the battlefield, but in the shadows. It was a war of spies, of conspiracies, of attempted assassinations. Fredegund, the master of this dark art, repeatedly sent assassins to kill Brunhilda and the young King Childebert. Gregory of Tours records several attempts. One assassin was sent disguised as an envoy, with a poisoned knife hidden in his sleeve. Another time, 2 clerics were dispatched with poisoned daggers, instructed to murder the queen and her son. All of these attempts failed, thwarted by Brunhilda's own efficient network of spies and the loyalty of her court. The captured assassins, under torture, would invariably confess that they had been sent by Queen Fredegund. This was a new kind of warfare, one defined by personal hatred and fought with the tools of treachery. The Frankish kingdoms were locked in a death struggle, but the hands guiding the daggers belonged to their queens. Brunhilda fought to preserve her son's inheritance and to finally achieve justice for her murdered sister. Fredegund fought with the desperate ferocity of a survivor, seeking to eliminate the rival who would always see her as a low-born usurper and a murderer. The kingdoms of their sons were merely the arenas for their personal combat. As the young kings grew older, they would inherit not just their father's crowns, but their mother's hatred. How could a kingdom possibly find peace when its very heart was poisoned by a feud so deep, so personal, and so utterly irreconcilable? The shadow war of assassins and spies defined the long middle chapter of the feud, a grim stasis where neither queen could gain the final advantage. But the children at the center of the conflict, Childebert II of Austrasia and the infant Clothar II of Neustria, were growing up. They were inheriting not just kingdoms, but a legacy of hatred. The feud was becoming institutionalized. Before this next generation could come to blows, however, the board changed once more. In the year 584, King Chilperic, the original cause of the feud, was himself assassinated while returning from a hunt. The identity of his killer remains one of history's unsolved mysteries. Was it an agent of Brunhilda, finally succeeding where so many others had failed? Was it a noble he had wronged? Or, as some whispered, was it an order from Fredegund herself, who perhaps feared her unstable husband was about to cast her aside? We will never know, but Fredegund, ever the survivor, acted swiftly. She seized the royal treasure, took refuge in the Cathedral of Paris, and secured the throne for her infant son, Clothar II. She was now the undisputed regent of Neustria, her power absolute. Across the border, Brunhilda's long career as a ruler began in earnest. For decades, she was the true power in the kingdoms of Austrasia and, eventually, Burgundy, which she came to control after the death of the childless king Guntram. She ruled first as regent for her son Childebert II, and after his death, as regent for her 2 grandsons, Dudebert II and Duderic II. And in her long tenure, you can see that she was more than just a vengeful fury. She was a stateswoman of remarkable ability and ambition. Her goals were clear and, in the context of her time, revolutionary. She sought to build a strong, centralized monarchy in the old Roman style. She worked to reform the kingdom's chaotic tax system, to replenish the royal treasury that had been depleted by decades of civil war. She sponsored the repair of old Roman roads, bridges, and fortifications, attempting to restore the infrastructure that had crumbled since the empire's fall. But every one of these sensible, forward-thinking policies earned her a powerful new enemy: the Frankish aristocracy, The great landowning nobles of Austrasia and Burgundy had grown immensely powerful during the years of infighting. They thrived on weak, decentralized kingship. They saw Brunhilda's reforms not as progress, but as a direct attack on their traditional rights and their autonomy. To them, she was a foreign woman, a Visigoth, an arrogant outsider who was trying to impose a Roman-style tyranny upon the free customs of the Franks. They began to resent her, to conspire against her, and to wait for an opportunity to remove her. They would not have to wait forever. The final act of this long and bitter drama began when Brunhilda was an old woman, well into her 70s. Her two grandsons, the kings of Austrasia and Burgundy, had fought each other in yet another pointless civil war, and one had been killed. Brunhilda, indomitable as ever, now ruled as regent for her great-grandson, the young King Sigebert, too. She was on the verge of total victory. She had united the forces of Austrasia and Burgundy and was preparing a final, decisive campaign to crush her lifelong enemies Clothair II of Neustria. After more than 40 years, it seemed Brunhilda was about to win the war. It was at this critical moment that the Austrasian nobles made their move, an influential faction of aristocrats, led by two men whose names would echo into the future Pepin of Landen and Bishop Arnulf of Metz. The two ancestors of the Carolingian dynasty decided they had had enough. Their hatred for their own powerful, centralizing queen was greater than their loyalty to her dynasty or their fear of the rival kingdom. They saw a future under Brunhilda as one of higher taxes and diminished noble power. They chose to protect their own interests. They made a secret pact with the enemy, Clothair II. They promised that if he invaded, they would not fight. They would betray their queen and hand her over to him. Clothair II advanced his army, and the plot unfolded as planned. The Austrasian and Burgundian armies, their leaders, having secretly defected, offered no resistance. Brunhilda, the formidable queen, now a great-grandmother, was captured along with her 4 young great-grandsons. The boys were executed immediately, wiping out her entire line. For Brunhilda herself, a far more terrible fate was reserved. Clothair II, the son of Fredegund, was now her judge and executioner. He subjected her to a show trial, accusing her of being responsible for the deaths of 10 Frankish Kinsa. Wild exaggeration that nonetheless encapsulated the decades of bloodshed she had been a part of. Her execution, in the year 613, was a spectacle of calculated brutality, designed to utterly destroy not just her body, but her legacy and royal image. For 3 days, the elderly queen was subjected to various forms of torture. Finally, she was brought before the entire army. In an ultimate act of humiliation, she was tied by her hair, 1 arm, and 1 leg to the tail of an untamed horse. The horse was then whipped into a frenzy, and it galloped away, dragging and tearing the queen's body apart across the rocky ground until she was dead. It was a horrific end to a remarkable life. And in a final, bitter irony, the woman who had started the feud, Fredegund, had not lived to see it. She had died peacefully in her bed years earlier, in 597, having successfully defended her son's kingdom and secured her own power until the end. It was Fredegund's son who had won the war, Fredegund's legacy that had triumphed. With Brunhilda's death, the long feud was finally over. Clothair II was now the undisputed sole king of all the Franks, having reunited the realm just as his grandfather and great-grandfather had done before him. But this unity had been bought at a steep price. To win the war, Clothair II was deeply indebted to the powerful nobles who had betrayed Brunhilda for him. A year after his victory, in 614, he issued the Edict of Paris. This landmark decree, which sounds so administrative and boring, was in fact a monumental concession. It formally guaranteed the rights, privileges, and vast landholdings of the nobility. Most importantly, it ensured that the most powerful office in the kingdom, besides the king, the mayor of the palace, would be held by these powerful aristocratic families. And so, the great 40-year war between 2 queens came to its conclusion. It was a conflict born from a personal grievance, the murder of a sister. It was sustained by decades of personal hatred, but its final outcome was deeply impersonal. Brunhilda, with her dream of a strong, Roman-style monarchy, had failed. Her ambition had clashed fatally with the deep-rooted traditions of a Frankish aristocracy that preferred weak kings and local autonomy. Fredegund, the ultimate survivor, had won through her son, but the victory was a hollow one for the dynasty itself. In order to win, her son had been forced to empower the very class of nobles who would, over the next century, systematically strip the Merovingian kings of all their real authority. The true winners of the long war between Brunhilda and Fredegund were neither of the queens, but the quiet, patient aristocrats like Pepin of Landen and Arnulf of Metz. The blood feud had bled the monarchy of its wealth and power, paving the long, slow road toward the age of the Roi, Faineants, the do-nothing kings and the eventual rise of a new dynasty, the Carolingians, from their own ranks. The story is a grim monument to how even the most powerful human passions can become mere instruments in the slow, inexorable grind of historical change.